Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming and enjoying our evening with ECMA, as we are very blessed to present with Aileen Friesen. Aileen has joined us for the entire weekend, actually, and has gone through several events and actually been staying at our house, and we've been enjoying some time and some stories about her international travels, some of the projects and books that she's been involved in. It's been a wonderful experience. So I think we're very, very blessed to have this evening come together. There was an entire list of you that actually went through some oral interviews with her for a project that she's received funding and is working on. And that will convert into podcasts and a book and some other things, if I understand. Is that correct? So we'll look forward to that in the future. Some of you may be called on in the future to meet with her via Zoom or via phone calls. We'll have to see how that plays out. So we're excited to have representation from the Leamington area and from our constituency involved in this project. So thank you. We'll go through the actual presentation of Aileen, and don't forget to stick around afterwards. There'll be a question and answer if you do have any questions that come up. Coffee, tea, and snacks, of course, are part of our Mennonite tradition here at ECMA, and they'll be provided in the other side. So don't run away when you're done. Stay and socialize and enjoy some time together. Aileen Friesen is the Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. She is also the Executive Director for the Plett Foundation. And her presentation this evening is going to be on Leaving Soviet Ukraine, Mennonites, and the Politics of Emigration. Please join me in a warm welcome, Aileen Friesen.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here this evening. And I was in Toronto for a week before I arrived in Leamington. And when I told Marina Unger, whom some of you might know from the Mennonite Heritage Cruises, that I was headed to Leamington, she told me I was in for a real treat and I was about to experience Leamington's hospitality. And I can assure you that Jim and Marielle Conrad have exceeded expectations with all of the wonderful ways in which they've welcomed me into their home. And all of you, especially those who I interviewed, I just really appreciate you taking the time to be here tonight and also to help me in my project. And I also would like to say thank you to the Essex-Kent Mennonite Historical Association for the invitation to be here tonight. You know, local historical associations are so important, and sometimes they get taken for granted by the community, but they are really the repository of your history, of the history of your parents, and a history that hopefully can help shape the future of this region, and it deserves to be remembered. So make sure that you continue your support of that association. So today I want to talk to you about leaving Soviet Ukraine and the politics of emigration. So this scene will be familiar to some of you. This is a scene on a boat with a bunch of Mennonite immigrants who are coming from the Soviet Union to Canada. And many of you have recorded your own family histories, for those of you who are linked to this migration, and you've recorded the path of your family as they made their way across worlds in order to end up here in Canada. And I want to sort of expand on this story a little bit and give you some background information into some of the issues that we haven't necessarily talked in depth about as we've told this history of immigration. And one of the themes that I've been interested in is when and why did Mennonites start to talk about emigration? And some of you are already thinking in your heads, well, of course they started to talk about it as they experienced the destruction of their villages and violence during the revolutionary period. But in fact, the conversation about emigration began before that moment in time, and actually began during the First World War. And Mennonites, this is a picture of Mennonites engaged, not only Mennonites, but other Russians, Ukrainians, and others engaged in the Red Cross and helping out at the front lines with medical treatment for wounded soldiers. And during this time, Mennonites really showed their patriotism to the Russian Empire. They performed all sorts of duties, not only on medical trains, but also giving donations to the war effort as the Russian Empire took part in World War I. But during this time, it became increasingly difficult to have the label of German. And one of the policies put in place or attempted to be put in place by the Russian state was the liquidation of Mennonite or German lands. So Mennonites were falling under that category of German lands. And the government was proposing to take away lands owned by Germans within the empire. And during this time, some of you might know that Mennonites went and put forward a proposal to the Russian state that in fact they weren't German, they were actually Dutch, an argument which they tried to bolster with Dutch language Bibles that they had brought with their families, and also other types of letters in support of this Dutch identity. But they also reached out to the British consul in Berdyansk and asked the British whether or not emigration to Canada might be possible. And the British then went and contacted the Canadian government and asked them, are you interested in having some Mennonites? So this is 1916. Are you interested in having some Mennonites come to settle in your country? And the Canadian government said, yeah, maybe, perhaps, that could be a possibility. And then this ends up being a conversation sent back to the British Foreign Office, and they decide that no, this actually isn't a good idea. It isn't a good idea because the Russian Empire is on their side fighting in World War I, and that in fact, and they didn't want to approach the Russian government to ask them for permission to allow these Mennonites to leave southern Ukraine. And so therefore, they decided to say, we'll deal with this later. And so that ended that conversation of potential migration to Canada in 1916. Now, of course, the liquidation laws were overturned when in February 1917, the Tsar was overthrown within the Russian Empire. And this introduced a new political situation in the Russian Empire in which now there had to decide, or there was discussion about what kind of government should be in place. It used to be a monarchy. They had introduced some representation with the Duma, with their parliament, but now that monarchy was gone. And this is, of course, before the Bolsheviks took power. And Mennonites were very interested also in figuring out what sort of government would best represent them. And during this time as well, there are conversations taking place within various elements of the Russian Empire about autonomy for different groups that had been a part of the empire for a longer period of time, including Ukraine. So there was discussion amongst Ukrainians about whether or not autonomy should be sought out, and there was a whole movement in order to attempt to bring autonomy to that region. And this, of course, facilitated a discussion amongst Mennonites about whether or not they would support the idea of Ukrainian independence. There were some who thought that this was going to be problematic. They wanted to make sure that their rights as a minority group were respected, and they were unsure of whether or not that could take place in an autonomous Ukraine, particularly their right to not participate in military service and to have alternative service for their young men. But others were supportive of the idea and thought that they could definitely have their rights protected within an autonomous Ukraine, and that one argument went that since many of them already spoke Ukrainian, that they could adapt to this new system quite readily, and that they should not be afraid of this possibility. Of course, that conversation sort of changed pace when the Bolsheviks or the communists took power in October 1917. And then we had another difficult situation. So the Bolsheviks take power. They start to insert their government into the southern Ukrainian region. There is some violence. There is some sort of disorganization. People are arrested. There's a lot of ransoms that take place during this time. And so officials would come in, they would kidnap people and then ask for a ransom from the local population in order to release that person. And then people would have to gather together money in order to get that done. And then we have the German occupation of southern Ukraine. And so the Germans will help set up a Ukrainian government in 1918, and they will occupy sort of this southern Ukrainian region. And during that time, under German occupation, this idea of emigration also is being discussed amongst Mennonites. Some Mennonites say that their homeland is in the southern Ukrainian region and they want to remain. Others want to investigate potential citizenship in Germany. So they want to be able to go with the Germans and resettle their communities and reestablish their communities in Germany. Of course, one of the issues at stake and one of the problems in sort of these conversations about migrating to Germany was alternative military service once again, whether or not that could be protected. And during this time, it's very interesting because Mennonites are also aware that by having these conversations about potentially leaving southern Ukraine, it could be viewed by some as being disrespectful to the government under which that they were living, the Ukrainian government that had been established. And so there's a lot of debate within the community about whether or not this should take place. Now, in the end, it wasn't their decision. Some Mennonites will leave with the retreating German army when Germany has to exit out of the First World War. And then now the lands in which Mennonites are living is being sort of fought over by the volunteer army or the white army, which wants to establish something other than Bolshevism. Some of them want to establish a monarchy, but some others want to establish various forms of government. And also, of course, the Machnosi, which many of you know about, the anarchists who are coming through and wanting to destroy or establish sort of their more localized understanding of governments. And also the Red Army, which represents the Bolsheviks. There's also Ukrainian nationalists that are fighting in this region as well. And so this is going back and forth, and this is where Mennonites get caught up in much of the violence that we have come to associate with this period. So that's in 1919, after the German army has left. Of course, Mennonites also established self-defense units, trying to at first maintain some semblance of peacefulness in their village, but they soon get subsumed in all the violence, and there's a variety of raids that also the Zelbschutz participate in, and it becomes a very violent and complicated period of time in which if you don't die of violence, then many times you'll die of typhus or other diseases that are spread through the movement of, I guess we can just describe it as dirty bodies through these homes. And it was very hard to keep clean, hard to find soap, and just the movement of all of these people helped spread disease, which killed many within the community, in addition to the violence that was brought into the villages through raids and other forms. And so we have, of course, the symbol of that, the mass grave. This picture was not taken at the time in which the massacre occurred, but was taken afterwards when MCC comes in to help with famine relief. So under these very difficult circumstances, we have something else going on in Canada which will help shape this immigration, the possibility of emigration. And that is the banning of Doukhobors, Hutterites, and Mennonites from coming into Canada, from immigrating to Canada through two 1919 orders in council by the Canadian government. And they ban these groups because, as the words on the screen indicate they are considered undesirable owing to their peculiar customs, habits, modes of living, and methods of holding property, and because of their probable inability to become readily assimilated to assume the duties and responsibilities of Canadian citizenship within a reasonable time after entry. So this is in 1919. Back in Ukraine, we have anarchy, destruction of villages taking place, and in Canada, we have the banning of Doukhobors, Mennonites, and Hutterites, and this comes out of the development of Canadian immigration policy, but also as a response to a few things. One was, of course, Canada had also been in World War I and had a population that was skeptical about Mennonites and their non-participation in the war. Two, we had the question of the school question, particularly in the Western provinces, in which groups of Mennonites who had come in the 1870s and were living in those provinces objected to the introduction of English into their schools and the objection to sort of government interference in their schools. And so they had been in conflict with provincial governments over these issues, and they had been threatening to leave Canada. And then we also had a group of Hutterites from the United States that was attempting to come into Canada. And these three trends sort of worked together to facilitate, in the eyes of the Canadian government, the need to respond through this order in council. And the debates in the House of Commons, in the Canadian House of Commons, are very interesting and very illuminating. And you might ask, well, didn't Mennonites have any defenders? And yes, there were some who defended Mennonites and said, no, these people are just fine and they can integrate, they can contribute to society. But the overarching sort of thread was that this was actually, that they were a problematic people in addition to Hutterites and Doukhobors, and therefore should not be allowed to come into the country. So this is just one of the flags of the school as a representation of the school question that the more conservative Mennonites were dealing with in the prairie provinces. Now, as we have the banning of Mennonites, so we have war, revolution, anarchy in Soviet Ukraine, we have the banning of Mennonites of coming to Canada, and then we have at the end of 1919, 1920, when things are kind of settling down, not in every place, there was still a lot of upheaval going on, and the sort of civil war of southern Ukraine has not ended. We have Mennonites deciding, joining together to discuss whether or not that they should search for new lands in order to find a place to live after all of the destruction of their villages. And also, of course, as many of you know, as people, Machnosi and other groups went through the countryside, those in the countryside had to flee into the villages. And so now we have a situation in which there's an overpopulation of people within Mennonite villages, and it gets more and more difficult to accommodate them. And so at the beginning of 1920, Mennonites send out a delegation of men, including this man, A.A. Friesen, to go try to figure out if they can find a place that will accept them. So of course, with emigration, you need two things. You need to have the country you're currently in allow you to leave, or to have some sort of exit out of that country. And then secondly, you also need to have a country to accept you that will allow you into their borders. And so they send out A.A. Friesen. He's not only there to try to find a country that will accept them, he's also there to finances in order to be sent back to Soviet Ukraine to help the people who are now facing the prospect of rebuilding. And so there is this struggle as and I actually interviewed one of his daughters who remembered, so she obviously wasn't born at that time, but remembered hearing about how her father would travel through the United States and Canada, going from church to church, trying to explain to people what had been going on, what had been taking place. Now, there was no sort of news on the TV, right? So there weren't the pictures to capture people's attention. You had to find ways to communicate the horrors that the Mennonites in Ukraine had been through. And in some places, he found audiences that were receptive to the message that he was giving, and in other places, people were less receptive to that. Also, he didn't always fit in very well. So he smoked, which of course was a taboo amongst some Mennonite communities, and was viewed with skepticism. Who is this guy coming here and trying to tell us that we need to give money and send it over to Ukraine because they're in desperate need and that they have to rebuild? So he ends up staying in Canada, and he will become a key figure in the migration, in helping to set up the migration to Canada. One more word about A.A. Friesen, because he's not a relative, so don't think that I'm trying to promote my relations amongst you. That's not what's happening here at all. But he was an incredibly intelligent man, so he was fluent, obviously, in German and Russian. He picked up English very quickly. I've seen correspondence that he wrote in the English language. It's actually amazing that he was able to be communicating with politicians in Canada in the English language and being able to work at representing the story of the people that he left behind. Now in Ukraine, although they've sent out this delegation also to Germany as well, Benjamin Unruh is there, and to places to try to figure out if any possibilities are open for emigration and also for financial help. We also have back in Ukraine an attempt to rebuild and also to negotiate a way in which Mennonites might be able to leave. And in the middle, we have B.B. Jans, who becomes a key figure in that negotiation process. And we also have Philip Cornies and J.I. Dick, who are helping B.B. Jans set up the Union of Citizens of Dutch Lineage, which is the organization that takes them some time, actually. They wanted to use Mennonite in their name, but the Soviet government, the established Soviet government said, Mennonites, that's religious. And they're like, no, we're people. And they're like, no, that's religious. So they had to call themselves the Dutch citizens instead of Mennonites. And they are going to attempt to both convince the Soviet government that in order to rebuild the Mennonite colonies in southern Ukraine, they need to be allowed to have people leave the country, which is an interesting proposition to make. And it finds some ears amongst Soviet officials who are open to the possibility of letting some people leave. This is also a time in which the Soviet government is just getting itself established, and there isn't necessarily the structure in place like there will be in the 1930s, let's say, in which that they can sort of control everything. There's a lot more ideas around the Soviet government at this moment in time, and they end up at least being allowed to set up this organization and start that process of figuring out what it would look like. But of course, at this point in time, they don't have a place to go, because the Canadian government has banned Mennonites from coming into the country. So they managed to figure out a deal with the Paraguayan government that maybe that they could go to Paraguay. And on the basis of this, because of course the Soviet government, that's their first question is, where are you going to go? You need to have a country to go to. And so then they use that in order to start to get permissions in order to leave, and they start to create lists of people who are looking and willing and want to leave. This is David Taves, who in Canada is helping to set up the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization, which will become the main vehicle by which Mennonites will immigrate from not only Soviet Ukraine, but also from the Soviet Union. And of course, he and A.A. Friesen and other people have a number of different tasks that need to be taken care of. First, they need to convince the government to lift the ban on the immigration of Mennonites, and they managed to get agreement from the Mackenzie King government that is in the process of trying to be elected to agree to do that. So Mackenzie King agrees to it, and when his government is elected, that that will eventually happen, although it takes a little bit of time. The other side is that they need money. So it's become very clear that in Soviet Ukraine and also the Soviet Union, many families will not have enough funds in order to pay for this trip to go to Canada. So David Taves negotiates a deal with Canadian Pacific Railway in order to fund this migration so that the Canadian Pacific Railway will give a loan and the Canadian Board of Colonization will be the ones who have to pay back that loan. I think David Taves personally signs that paper without consulting with everyone, but he thinks it has to be done, so that's how it goes. And so then they start that process of at least opening up the possibility of bringing people over because they have at least some access to money. The CPR has agreed. And then also they have a permission from the Canadian government to allow this to happen. Now, many of you probably already know that side of the story, but the side that you perhaps don't know is at the same time as all of this is taking place, the Canadian Pacific Railway is actually sending someone to Moscow to try to negotiate with the Soviets a deal in which they can have sort of passenger trade from the Soviet Union to Canada and also from the United States and Canada back to the Soviet Union. So in 1921, now first you have to remember that after the collapse of the Tsarist regime and then the takeover of power by the Bolshevik government, then we have a civil war that takes place all through the former Russian Empire. We also have the British and amongst others funding the volunteer army that is trying to defeat the Red Army. So you had the imperial government, Russian government's former allies in the war are now working together in order to try to make sure the Soviets don't win the Civil War. Guess what? Soviets win the Civil War. And so now there's a bit of a difficult dance that needs to be done diplomatically, because on the one hand, the British are interested in resuming trade with that part of the world, but on the other hand, they were just funding people to try to defeat the government that's in power. And so the British managed to get over this by signing a trade agreement with the Soviet regime. Canada, so that's in 1921. In 1922, Canada also signs a deal with the Soviet regime and for a trade agreement. And once this happens, all of these shipping companies end up going to Moscow to try to set up their business. So they see this as an opportunity. And they're interested in three things. They're interested in potential freight traffic. They're interested in potential passenger traffic. They're interested in remittances, so the sending of money. They know that there's a bunch of relatives and friends in North America who might want to send money to their relatives in the Soviet Union, and so they want to be that facilitator of sending that money. And so they end up establishing the British government establishes a mission in Moscow, and this is the building that they had used. And then all of these shipping companies use that mission in order to try to get access to Moscow and try to negotiate something with the government, the Soviet government. And like I said, we always think of everyone's fleeing, but actually the vision was not just about people leaving the Soviet Union, but also people who wanted to go to the Soviet Union to be able and have that opportunity to do so. And there were actually some Doukhobors and other groups that were interested in going to the Soviet Union. And so these shipping companies, British, Canadian, Holland, America Line, they are there, and they, in conjunction with the Soviet regime, end up setting up a joint stock company called the Russo-Canadian American Passenger Agency, or Ruskalpa. And some of you have documents of Ruskalpa in your possession from your parents. And this agency was meant exactly to facilitate what I just said, travel from the Soviet Union and travel to the Soviet Union, and is supposed to organize that process to sort of streamline it. Now, this agency gets set up in 1923 although the first train of Mennonites had already left. So this is in fall 1923, and it is in June 1923 that the first train of Mennonites leave, but this will become one of the main organization by which Mennonites, I mean, you have to get permissions, all sorts of permissions you have to get. So it's not just from this group, but it'll become one of the main organizations to help people with planning their transportation out of the Soviet Union. And so, of course, approximately 21,000 Mennonites, not just from Soviet Ukraine, but from across the Soviet Empire, will take advantage of this opportunity. Now, some people wanted to take advantage but couldn't. So if you had someone who is sickly in your family, you probably weren't getting permission to go. You know, there's all sorts of different ways in which that became difficult for many people to get out. And if you didn't get your name on the list soon enough, then obviously by the end of this period, doors are increasingly narrow and it's increasingly harder to get out. But this is one of the pictures of people of Mennonites leaving the Soviet Union. Many people use the word fled to describe the ways in which their ancestors left during the 1920s. And on the one hand, there's that feeling of fleeing in the sense that there was a lot of uncertainty. They had gone through the violence of the revolutionary period. They had gone through a famine in the early 20s, which MCC helped many people survive. So there is that sense of, escaping, but there also is some almost frivolity that comes along with many of these journeys. So for instance, many people would have to go to Moscow, not everyone, but many people would have to go to Moscow, and you would be surprised at the number of Mennonites visiting, for instance, the mausoleum of Lenin. So the mausoleum gets created after Lenin's death in 1924. There's a number of people who went there. Also references to the Moscow Zoo. So people sometimes got stuck in Moscow and they were sitting around and looking for things to do. Now, of course, this is especially the young people. Older people were probably fretting over how they were going to be able to figure out the transportation of their children and making sure that everyone had enough to eat in order to get to the border. But at least there was a little bit of this taking place according to memoir literature. And interestingly enough, we have this picture of the Red Gate, which is at the bottom. This, for many people, was a postcard that was purchased. So what ended up happening was after the revolutionary period and the Civil War, Latvia emerges as its own country, right? It had been a part of the Russian Empire, and it emerges as its own country, and they have to set up a border there. And so that becomes almost also a novelty for some people. Now, of course, there are very heart-wrenching depictions of people coming through that Red Gate and singing and feeling free and feeling that they had escaped a regime that was only going to get worse and worse. But they have many times this remnant of that moment from what was sort of this developing culture of postcards. And so that's where we get these postcards from. Now, Mennonites will come through into Latvia, and one of the first things that will happen is they will be disinfected at a station. And this, I was trying to figure out how this station came to be, if it was just built because Mennonites were going through there. But actually, it was a station that was initially established in order to welcome back Latvians who are coming from various parts of the former Russian Empire back into Latvia. So before Mennonites arrived there, Latvians who were coming back through were using that as their first stop in order to get to be deloused and to have their baggage gone through to disinfect it, and then they were allowed to carry on. They also could access various agencies there at that spot, and then later on that becomes one of the key places for Mennonites to be dealt with. And I should also add that we like to think of this as a Mennonite journey, but in reality, as the papers of Raskalpa reveal, there were other groups who used that agency as well in order to leave the Soviet Union. So there was a Jewish migration that was taking place through Ruskalpa. There were other Germans who were using it. There were other groups that also used Ruskalpa in order to leave the Soviet Union. And we have just here one of the, sort of these disinfection stamps showing that. And this is one of, I think, a very interesting and illuminating document in which we have, as you can see, first inspection here, Dr. Hummel. Second inspection here, Dr. Drury. Third inspection here, Dr. Hummel. So that was how, this was sort of the development of Canadian immigration policy, in which they were felt very threatened or wanting to protect against unhealthy people coming into Canada. So there wasn't one medical inspection. For many people, there were 3. And at any point in time, if that doctor did not sign off on you continuing on with your journey, then you were not continuing on with your journey. So we have memoirs of Mennonites being stuck in Latvia. Obviously, there were some on the first train who end up in Germany, and then what many people know of Southampton in Atlantic Park. There were many people stopped there. And it didn't matter if you were traveling in a group, if you were deemed to be unhealthy, particularly if you had trachoma, a disease of the eye, then you were not allowed to go. And there are just really fascinating depictions of, first of all, the ways in which people tried to treat themselves for this or get treatment for this trachoma, and the ways in which there was doctors and other people involved in these negotiations. And it got so bad at some point, David Taves writes to the CPR and he's like, well, this just can't be. Like, these are healthy people, you have to let them through. And they said that they disagreed with his assessment of that. And so once you got into Latvia, you end up in a place called, you go through Riga and end up in a place at that time called Libau or Lepatiev, right, at this moment. And then that's where you board the ship in order to make your way first mainly to England, where you would catch a larger ship in order to make your way to Canada. As I said before, there were a number of people who got stopped in England and had to stay there for longer periods of time because of health reasons, or because they couldn't pass the health inspections by the Canadian government. And they ended up in a place called Atlantic Park, which was established by shipping companies in order to deal with these types of issues, particularly because the context of this time is a massive refugee crisis that came out of World War I. And so there were all sorts of people everywhere, and they had to be moved, and some of them didn't have papers and permissions, and so the shipping companies set up this place, Atlantic Park. It was particularly used by Jewish immigrants who were trying to get to various places, and then it also becomes a home for Mennonites, and they took a former airfield and they established this sort of camp where Mennonites, including, and I inserted this picture because it includes my grandfather, so you can see if you can figure out which one looks the most like me. My grandfather got stuck in Moscow. His family went forward in 25. He was stuck in Moscow, and then he got stuck because of trachoma, and then he got stuck again in Atlantic Park, and then he eventually made it to Canada. So all of this is taking place, and Mennonites are streaming into Canada, and then we have a crisis taking place in 1927. On the one hand, we have a break in relations between the British and Soviet government, but we also have various groups sort of unhappy with immigration and unhappy with immigration from Central and Eastern Europe. So as Mennonites are coming in, there's also a movement. There was the 1925 Railway Agreement in which the Canadian government gave the railways permission to seek out immigrants, farmers in other countries to bring them to Canada because Canada was facing a labor crisis agriculturally. So Mennonites fit this bill, right, of coming in, and this is part of the reason why it is focused on agricultural workers, and there's also questions by some Canadian officials about whether or not the people, Mennonites coming in, are actually good for agriculture, because as some of you know, there were people who came who didn't really actually want to farm. And so we had this like influx, not only of Mennonites, but of other immigrant groups coming from Central and Eastern Europe. And we have some pushback within the Canadian British society of these types of migrants and questioning whether or not these are actually good for the fabric of Canada. And I like to end with something like this, just to remind us that first of all, in 1919, Mennonites were banned from coming to Canada. They were deemed to be peculiar and undesirable. And then by the end of the 1920s, we have this issue of undesirability appearing again within the media. And so this kind of shows the ways in which groups can get labels attached to them that perhaps they do not deserve. Hopefully many of us feel that Mennonites actually came to Canada and made incredibly important contributions to this country, to helping build up this country. But we can see the ways in which these sort of thoughts get picked up and carried out into the world and can have negative consequences. Now, it wasn't just this anti-immigration ideas that were floating around Canada. It wasn't just the break in relations between the Soviet government and the British government, and as it led also to difficulties with the Canadian and Soviet relations. It is also, of course, the Soviet government kind of finding its feet as it has time to build up its own ideology, and also has time to move out some of the people who perhaps had more moderate ideas about what this government should be like. And so then we also see that the narrowing of those doors are happening kind of on all fronts. And this will end the migration. Obviously, it doesn't end in 1927, but by 1930, the ability of Mennonites to leave the Soviet Union has legally leave the Soviet Union has disappeared. So that is my presentation, and now I am happy to take any questions that you might have. 2 questions, so you can decide who gets to go first. The German army or the British army? The German army. The German army, yeah. So it's by kind of the fall of 1918 that we have the exodus of the summer, fall of 1918, that we have the exodus of the German army from southern Ukraine. The writing was on the wall. Things were falling apart and collapsing, and the Germans were popular amongst the Mennonites because the German army helped the Mennonites, and even in some cases people had lost their land in that early part of 1918, and then the Germans helped them reclaim that land from the neighbors and so that also contributed to some difficult feelings amongst some communities. And so there were already sort of partisan activity happening, and there was it seemed clear that there was going to be a lot of violence once the Germans left, and that is also one of the reasons why the Germans helped to organize the Selbstschutz and the self-defense units to help. I mean, they organized it before they actually had to leave because there was just so much that they had to monitor, and they didn't really want to be there protecting the local population, so they wanted to teach them how to protect themselves. Yeah, so the question was whether or not there was sort of hardships in deciding whether or not to leave, and how that affected family members when some left and some stayed. And you see it very much in the literature, the memoir literature, and also in letters. So yes, there were some people who couldn't leave because of medical reasons, but there were also others who chose to stay, and they believed because of the new economic policy that the Soviet government put in place, that things were going to get better. And in their defense, it was also, many governments didn't believe that the Soviet regime would last. Like, they didn't think that these guys could figure out how to run a country. It's one thing to take over a place, but then to actually govern it, like, that's something a little bit different. And so there was that sentiment out in the world that perhaps this was going to be short-lived, and then we were going to get back to something else. And so it's not because they didn't fully understand the situation that they stayed. It's that they thought that there was prospects for the future. Some also didn't want to have to be newcomers in a place. They understood the language, they understood the culture where they were living, and that they thought that they could make a go out of it. And it turns out they were wrong. But there were indications that perhaps they might have been right. And there actually were some cases of people coming to Canada, Mennonites coming to Canada, and then saying, well, I don't want to stay here. Like, this is horrible. I want to go back. Now, of course, they didn't or couldn't picture Stalinism. And so, and you also, it's interesting to see who chooses to leave. So there's lots of ministers who choose to leave. Obviously, they were kind of on the front lines of the attack against religion. A lot of teachers, too, were the ones who were being sort of persecuted by the original Soviet state. And so we have a lot of teachers also leaving at the same time. And then there were some people who actually, because of that, chose to stay. So I know at least of one example of a minister who said, like, if we all leave, there's going to be no spiritual leadership here, and we have to stay. And it turned out very, very badly for him, but he felt he was living out his faith. Yes, so some were taken into the Red Army. Some also, so we say, now there were some people who didn't have a choice to go into these various situations, but we should also acknowledge that some people joined. So there were Mennonites who joined the White Army, who felt like they wanted to defend their way of life through participation in that sort of service. There was also a German battalion that was organized in which Mennonites participated in. And then there were some who were sort of taken into the Red Army, but then there were also a few, many less. If they're joining voluntarily, Mennonites are normally joining the White Army, but there were some who joined the Red Army, and there were also some who joined the Machnovci. So also very few, but we do have historical examples of that also occurring. So there's division and this isn't surprisingly, there's always divisions in thinking, and some people thought a certain way, and then they used that framework, inform their actions. So part of the issue in these communities was a disparity even amongst Mennonites, which the Mennonites of the time knew about, but sometimes we, in subsequent generations, have overlooked. So there was disparity between certain groups within Mennonites. In other words, some Mennonites were poor, and the Machnovci attempted to speak to that situation. And there were also some who were probably just wanted to participate in the plundering. There's also, that we aren't disengaged from those types of motivations. We've seen it. And even there's one example from an interview. He didn't end up joining the Machnovci, but he was invited to join them, and he sort of saw what they were doing, and he was invited because he was poor. He's from a poor Mennonite family, and they said, "Hey, come join us." And he saw what they were doing. He's like, "No, I don't want to have anything to do with that." So definitely there were a variety of motivations, and sometimes because more Mennonites were on the wealthier part of the spectrum, we sometimes overlooked that there were Mennonites who had a lot less than their other Mennonite neighbors, even if they were a part of the same church congregation. Yes, so I was just at the place in Southampton, England. I wasn't at the actual location, but that is in Southampton. That is where the big steamships could go. So that's where the Titanic left from, and that's where the steamships are going, or the ships are going from England to North America. And so because of, like I said, difficulties in passing medical exams and making sure that one had the proper papers. So during this time, also what ends up happening is the United States is reforming their immigration policy and putting quotas on the number of people that can come from a specific area. So then you end up having people sort of caught in transit, not able to get to places. And the steamship companies had already created before this problem, but then they used Atlantic Park as a location to put people, because if people can't get somewhere, right, you need somewhere to house them, and you can't just kind of put them into the population. So they put them into this Atlantic Park, and there are beds and kitchen facilities and other things to help to keep the immigrants occupied. They were allowed to leave, and they weren't sort of enclosed there, but that was the purpose of Atlantic Park. And many Mennonites, like I said, not many, a lot more Jewish migrants were there, but there were definitely Mennonites and some who stayed for years in Atlantic Park because they couldn't get permission to continue on with their journey. There was another one. Oh, we got two back here. I don't think that they were very aware of it. I think that it was the leaders who are aware of all of these negotiations, and this is also why some of the people who are anxious to leave are not understanding why we can't make things move faster, and this must be the fault of the leaders who are clearly not capable of representing our interests, and that it becomes, Mennonites, this is, there's always dissatisfaction, it seems, in the air, and it made for a very difficult situation for some of these leaders who are trying to explain to people, like, this is a very complicated situation. And not only is it complicated, so these higher level diplomatic negotiations, no one is going to stop at these higher levels and say, oh, but there are these Mennonites that are trying to get out, so maybe we should accommodate them, right? Like, Mennonites are unimportant in these discussions, because even like the British and the Soviets and the other European powers are trying to deal with this massive refugee crisis of people who fled out of the former revolutionary empire, and so there's all sorts of other things going on, and so they aren't really focused on making sure that some people can leave out of the Soviet Union. That's not their concern. And so on the one hand, it's really incredible that Mennonites were able to represent themselves at all sorts of different tables within each individual country to be able to make this happen. It was not very important to a lot of people, and that there was some discontent amongst Mennonites themselves as they question why this is taking so long. Yes, and so I am also a product of a Burgtaller Old Colony 1870s migration and a 1920s migration, so we are kindred spirits. And I often, depending on the group, will represent myself in different ways. So in certain groups, I'm an 1870s Canadier, and in other groups, I'm a 1920s Russlander. So this is interesting because, first of all, yes, there were tensions with the groups because they didn't necessarily do things in similar ways, and they had a lot of, they were both sort of set in thinking that they were doing things the right way. But on the other hand, if we look at what they did, so here in Ontario, it's the same thing with the Swiss Mennonites. So all of these Mennonites from Ukraine and other places show up, and they need to have a place to live. And here in Ontario, it was the Swiss Mennonites who took them in and gave them homes and gave them jobs. Now, there were also difficulties in that relationship, but it's pretty amazing for them to open their homes up and allow people to come in. Same thing's happening in places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba. You need to house these people. And what happens is a train comes in and all the people from the village come out and they take a family home with them. And they feed that family and they attempt to help that family get on their feet. Now, not all of these relationships were positive, but we have to acknowledge that many of us are not opening our homes to people to come in and feeding them and taking care of them, right? And so that was a pretty extraordinary gesture on the part of the Canadier. Now, of course, once people get settled and then then you can sort of develop your animosities against each other, which they did. And the Russlander often thought of themselves as being more educated, more sophisticated than their Canadier brethren. And the Canadier thought the Russlander were worldly and had, a very unfortunate outlook on spiritual life. And so there were all sorts of tensions there. But sometimes I just like to bring us back to that moment at the train stations in which there's all these people coming in and they have nothing and they have no money and someone has to take care of them. And it's not the Canadian government, right? The Canadian government is not doing that job. It's Mennonites. The Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization told the Canadian government that Mennonites would not become a charge on the system. We will take care of our own. And they made that promise, and that was part of the ways in which this migration was allowed to happen. Yeah, so like I said, there were tensions, but sometimes we should not overlook the positives that came out of that relationship. Yes. Yes, the question was what about Atlantic Park and whether or not there's still anything there. No, there's nothing there. They dismantled it. So it had been a hangar that the U.S. Army had built during World War I, and then the shipping companies bought it, they refurbished it, they brought immigrants in, but then they closed the doors on it, and then it was dismantled later on. And there have been some histories that I can send you about describing the Atlantic Park, and so, but there's nothing remaining there. And interestingly enough, there isn't any, the documentation is very limited. I think it's because it wasn't a government-run organization, it was being run by the shipping companies, so they had all the documentations for that institution. And so we have some recollections of people who went through there, but we haven't been able to find that much information. Oh, I gave a whole talk about this at some place, but now I forget about the actual numbers. So first of all, I would also point out that not every family got a Reiseschuld. So there were some families who did not use that CPR credit and were able to, for a variety of reasons, able to put together the money in order to pay for their own passage, or they had relatives forward the money and those people were able to travel to Canada without incurring a debt. But the actual debt was paid off right before the immigration of the 40s to Canada. So it took a long time to pay off. I'd have to look into my notes to see how much. And in the end, I think they had to cancel some of the interest, but the interest was pretty high, right? Like this wasn't just dollar for dollar. There was interest charged by the CPR. And so perhaps it was okay for that. I would like to see their books. They haven't books open to me to see how much money they were able to raise through this endeavor. But of course, the Mennonites were very grateful, and rightfully so, that the CPR took the chance to allow that money to move forward. But I would also point out that, like, throughout this period, there are times in which the CPR is approaching the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization and saying, you got to give us some money. Like, we're not going to open up more credit for you until you pay us back some of that money, because we got to see actual movement on this. And so then those members, A.A. Friesen, David Taves, would have to go out into the community and be like, please give us some money, because if you don't give us this money, then CPR is not going to extend more credit, and we're not going to be able to bring people to the country. And so that's happening during the 20s as they're trying to make sure that that money continues to flow from the CPR. One more question, Jim tells me, and then we have to go have cake and coffee. So they're coming from what was formerly the Prussian territory. So the Polish-Lithuanian Empire had been divided by the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, and so they had divided up that territory, and then there's a section that is under Prussian control, and Mennonites are coming from sort of that division, but they're coming from that eastern part. They had come originally from the Netherlands to that area, and then they come out of that. So this isn't a migration that is going through other places at that time when Catherine is indicating her, or is putting out her invitation to settlers. It's coming kind of specifically from the former Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and then they're coming into the Russian Empire.
That was excellent, Aileen. Thank you very much. We're very excited to be able to offer these type of informative and educational presentations. So this is kind of a new vision and a new energy that we're trying to put into ECMA. I hope you felt that this winter and into the springtime. And I can tell you that our board is hard at work to prepare for next year, and we almost have a full schedule at this point. Quickly, a story about how this came together. I was doing research for our original education presentation where we had stories in Mennonite history, and I was lacking in knowledge, of course, deeply. And I was on YouTube, and endlessly Aileen's name kept coming up. And so I reached out to her by email, and I think it was hours or possibly the next day, she got back to me and was willing to sit on a Zoom call with me, and that turned into a deeper discussion about coming to Leamington and presenting and the project that you're working on. So you don't get what you don't ask for, and I'm extremely excited that she was willing to give as much support and energy as was needed for this, and we were happy to host you and enjoy the time together. I have to tell you, though, any comments that I have about Mennonite history, I'm getting a head shake once in a while and cut off very quickly. So I've learned quite a bit this weekend. I also want you to be aware, with this new energy and this new vision from the ECMA board, we do have fundraising realities that come with that. We are in a budgetary scenario of approximately $50,000 required to run this year, and we're gonna look to you for your support. If this speaks to you, the preservation work and these presentations that we do, please help us to continue this. If you accidentally missed Marielle and the rest of the girls at the table, Marielle Conrad, my wife, would be happy to speak to you. You are receipted for these donations, and we do require them in order to continue these type of programs, and we really want to do this. Our board is hard at work at announcements for new capital projects. As we review our office space, our museum and archives, we're very excited about the opportunities that lie in the future, and you will be hearing from our board in the near future about our direction in reference to those capital projects. I'll also make you aware, ECMA recommended event, there is a Mennonite Heritage Tour coach bus going to Pelee Island from Leamington on Wednesday, July 2nd. This will include stories, sites. This is an air-conditioned bus with washroom, and Ron Thiessen, the historian and author, is on the island and is involved in this, as well as Christine Palachuk from the Mission Hall. And it's going to be a wonderful day and an experience of understanding why Mennonites went to Pelee Island, their contributions that took place while they were there, and ultimately why they ended up leaving and coming back to the mainland. Have a great night. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming and enjoying our evening with ECMA, everybody. As we are very blessed to present very much for coming with and enjoying our evening with Aileen ECMA. Has joined us for the entire weekend, actually, with Aileen Friesen. Gone through several events, has joined us for the entire weekend, at our house. We've been enjoying some time and some stories about her international travels, at our house, and some of the projects and books that she's been involved in. It's been a wonderful international travels. I think we're very blessed to have this evening. It's been a wonderful experience. There was an entire list. I think we're very went through some oral interviews with her for a project. There was an entire list of you that actually went through some oral interviews with her for a project and a book and some other things and is working on. Correct? And that will convert. So we'll look forward to that in the future. And a book and some other things. Some of you may be called on in the future. So we'll look forward to meet with her via Zoom or via some of you may be called on in the future how that plays out. So we're excited to have representation from the Leamington area. We'll have to see how that plays out. So we're excited to have representation from the Leamington area and from our constituency involved in this project. And don't forget to stick around afterwards. There'll be a question and answer if you do have any questions that come up. And don't forget to stick around afterwards. There'll be a question and answer if you do have any questions that come up. And they'll be provided in the other side. So don't run away when you're done. Stay and socialize and enjoy some time. And they'll be provided in the other side. So don't run away when you're done. Stay and socialize and enjoy some time together. Aileen Friesen is the associate professor and co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. And co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. And her presentation this evening is going to be on Leaving Soviet Ukraine, Mennonites and the political politics of emigration. On Leaving Soviet Ukraine, and a warm welcome, Aileen Friesen. Politics of emigration. Please
Thank
join
you
me in a
so
warm
much.
welcome,
I'm so
Aileen
excited
Friesen.
to be here this evening, and I
Thank
was
you
in
so much.
Toronto
I'm
for a
so
week
excited
before
to be
I
here
arrived
this
in
evening,
Leamington.
and I was
when I
in
told
Toronto
Marina
for a
Unger,
week
whom
before
some of
I
you might
arrived in
know from the
Leamington,
Mennonite Heritage
and when I told
Cruises,
Marina
that I was
Unger,
headed
whom
to
some of you
Leamington,
might know
she
from the
told me I
Mennonite
was in for a
Heritage
real
Cruises,
treat,
and
that
I
I
was
was
about
headed
to
to
experience
Leamington.
Leamington
She told me I was in for a
hospitality.
real treat,
And I can assure
and I was
you
about to
that Jim and
experience
Marielle
Leamington's
Conrad have exceeded
hospitality.
expectations.
And I can assure you
with
that
all
Jim and Marielle
the
Conrad
wonderful ways
have
in which they
exceeded
welcomed me into their
expectations,
homes, and all of
with
you,
all
especially those who
the
I
wonderful ways in which they
I just
welcomed
really
me into their
appreciate,
home,
and all of you
taking the time
especially
to
those
be here
who I
tonight, and also
interviewed,
to help
I just
me
really
in my
appreciate
project. You taking the time to be here tonight,
And I also would like to
help
say
me
thank
in
you
my
to the
project.
Essex
Kent Mennonite Historical Association for the
And I also
invitation
would like
to
to
be
say
here
thank you
tonight.
to the
You know,
Essex
local
Kent Mennonite
historical
Historical
associations are
Association
so
for the
important
invitation to be here
and
tonight.
sometimes they
You
get
know,
taken for
local
granted by
historical
the
associations
community,
are
but
so
they are
really,
important.
the
And sometimes they get taken
repository
for granted
of your
by the
history of the
community, but
history
they
of
are
your
really,
parents,
and a history that
repository
hopefully
of
can
your
help
history of the history
shape
of
the
your
future
parents,
of this region,
and a history
and
that
it
hopefully
deserves
can
to be
help
remembered. So
shape the
make sure that
future
you continue
of
your
this
support
region,
of that
and it deserves to
association.
be remembered. So
today
make
I want
sure
to
that
talk to you
continue
about
your
leaving
support of
Soviet
that
Ukraine and the
association.
politics of emigration.
So today I want to talk to you
So
about
this
leaving
scene
Soviet Ukraine
will be
and the
familiar
politics
to
of
some of you.
immigration.
This is a scene on a
So
boat
this
with a bunch
scene
of with a
will be
bunch
familiar
of
to
Mennonite
some of you. This is a
immigrants
scene
who are
on a
coming
boat with a bunch
from
of
the Soviet
with a
Union
bunch of
to
Mennonite
Canada.
Immigrants
And
who are coming
many
from
of you
the Soviet
have
Union to
recorded
Canada.
your own family histories.
And
For those of
many
you who
of
are
you
linked to this migration,
have,
and
recorded
you've
your own family
recorded
histories.
the
For those of you who
path
are
of your
linked to this
family as they
migration,
made their
and
way
you've
across
recorded
the
worlds
path of
in
your
order to
family
end
as
up
they
here
made their
in
way
Canada.
across.
And I want
worlds
to
in
sort of
order to end
expand
up
on this
here
story a
in
little bit
Canada.
and give you some
And I want
background
to
information
sort of expand
into
on this
some
story
of
a little
the
bit and give you
issues
some
that we
background
haven't necessarily
information
talked
into
in depth
some
about
of
as we've
the
told
issues
this
that we
history
haven't necessarily
of immigration.
talked
And
in
one of the
depth
themes
about
that
as
I've been
we've
interested
told
in
this
is
history
when and
of
why
immigration.
did
And one
Mennonites
of the
start to
themes
talk
that
about
I've been
immigration?
interested in,
And some of you are
is
already
when
thinking in
and
your
why
heads, well,
did
of course
Mennonites
they
start to
started
talk about
immigration.
as they
And some of you are already thinking in
the
your heads,
destruction of
well,
their
of course they
villages
started
and
to talk
violence
about it
during the
as they
revolutionary
experience
period.
the
But in
destruction of their
fact, the
villages and
conversation
violence
about
during the
emigration
revolutionary
began
period.
before
But in
that
fact,
moment
the
in
conversation
time,
about
and
emigration
actually began
during
before
the
that
First
moment
World
in time.
War.
And actually
Mennonites,
began during
this is a picture
the
of Mennonites
First World
engaged,
War.
not only Mennonites
And
but other
Mennonites,
Russians,
this is a picture
Ukrainians,
of
and others
Mennonites
engaged
in
not only
the Red
Mennonites but
Cross,
other
and helping
Russians,
out
Ukrainians,
at the front
and others
lines with
engaged
medical
in
treatment
the
for
Red
wounded
Cross,
soldiers,
and helping
and during
out
this
at the
time,
front
Mennonites
lines with medical
really showed
treatment
their
for wounded
patriotism,
soldiers.
to
And during
the
this
Russian
time,
Empire.
Mennonites
They
really showed their
performed all sorts of
patriotism,
duties to
not
the
only
Russian
on
Empire.
medical trains,
but
performed
also
all
giving
sorts of
donations
duties
to the war
not
effort
only on
as
medical
the Russian
trains,
Empire took
but also
part in
giving
World
donations
War
to the
I.
war effort as the
but
Russian
during this
Empire
time,
took
it became
part in
increasingly
World War
difficult
I.
to have the label of
But during
German.
this time, it became
And
increasingly
one of the policies
difficult
put
to
in
have
place
the
by
label
the
of
or
German.
attempted to be put in place
And
by the
one
Russian
of the policies
state
put in place
was
by
the
the
liquidation
attempted to be put in place
of
by the
Mennonite
Russian or
state
German lands. So
was the
Mennonites were falling
liquidation
under that category of
Mennonite
German lands
or German
and the government was
lands. So Mennonites
proposing
were
to take
falling under
away
that category
lands
of
owned
German
by
lands.
Germans
And the government was
within the
proposing to take
empire.
away
And
lands
during
owned
this time,
by
some of
Germans
you might know that
within the
Mennonites
empire.
went and put forward a
And
proposal
during
to the
this
Russian
time,
state that in
some of
fact
you
they
might
weren't
know that
German, they were
Mennonites
actually
went and put
Dutch.
forward a proposal to the
An
Russian
argument
state that in
in
fact
which
they weren't German.
they
They
tried
were
to
actually
bolster
Dutch,
with Dutch language
an
Bibles
argument
that they had
which
brought with their
they
families.
tried to bolster
and also
with
other
Dutch
types
language
of letters
Bibles that they had
support
brought
of
with
this
their
Dutch
families,
identity,
and also other
but they
types of
also
letters
reached
in
out
support
to
of
the
this
British
Dutch
consul
identity
in Berdyansk.
But they also
and
reached
asked
out
the British
to
whether
the British
or not
consul
immigration to
in
Canada
Berdyansk
might be possible.
and asked the British whether
And
or
the
not
British then
immigration to
went and
Canada
contacted
might
the
be
Canadian
possible.
government and asked them,
And the British
are you
then
interested in
went
having
and
some
contacted the
Mennonites.
Canadian government.
So this is
and asked them,
1916. Are you interested in having some
in
Mennonites come,
Mennonites
to
so this is
settle in your
1916.
country?
Are you interested
And
in
the
having
Canadian
some
government
Mennonites
said,
come?
yeah,
to
maybe perhaps
settle
that
in your
could
country.
be a possibility.
And the Canadian government
And then
said,
this ends
yeah,
up being
maybe
a conversation
perhaps
sent
that could
back
be
to
a
the British
possibility.
Foreign Office.
And then this ends
And
up
they
being a
decide
conversation
that
sent
no,
back
this
to the
actually
British
isn't a
Foreign
good idea.
Office.
It isn't a good
And
idea
they
because the
decide
Russian
that
Empire
no, this actually isn't a good idea. It isn't a good idea fighting in Russian Empire, and that in fact, and they didn't want to approach the Russian government fighting in World War I permission to allow these Mennonites, and they didn't want to approach the Russian government to ask them for permission to allow these Mennonites to leave, say, southern Ukraine. We'll deal with this later. And so therefore, and so that ended that conversation of potential migration to Canada. And so that ended that conversation of potential migration. Now, of course, the liquidation laws were overturned when, now, of course, the liquidation laws were overturned. The Tsar was overthrown when in the Russian February Empire. 1917, and this introduced a new political situation in the Russian Empire. And this introduced now they had to decide, or there was discussion in the Russian Empire, and what kind of government now there had to decide, or there was discussion monarchy. They had introduced what kind of government representation. It used to be a monarchy. They had introduced some, but now that monarchy was gone. And this is, of course, before the Bolsheviks. But now that monarchy was gone. And Mennonites were very interested also in figuring out what sort of government would best represent them. And Mennonites were very interested also in during this time as well, there are conversations taking place. And during this time as well, there are conversations taking place about autonomy for different elements of that had been Russian Empire about for a longer period of time, for different groups that had been a part of the empire. Discussion amongst Ukrainians about whether or not autonomy should be sought out, and there was a whole Ukrainians about whether or not autonomy should be sought out to that region. And this, of course, facilitated a discussion amongst Mennonites about whether or not they would support facilitated a discussion amongst Mennonites about whether or not they there were some who thought that this was going to be problematic. They wanted there were some who thought that this was going to be problematic. They wanted and they were unsure of whether or not that minority group were in an autonomous Ukraine, and they were unsure of whether or not that could take place in an autonomous Ukraine, to not participate in military service and to have alternative right service for their to not participate in military service. But others were supportive of the idea and thought that they could definitely have their rights protected. But others were supportive of the idea and thought that they could definitely have their rights protected went that since many of them already spoke Ukrainian, that they one argument went that since many of them already spoke Ukrainian,